43 years of unyielding progressive revolution from Senator Bernie Sanders just violently collided with a 17-year paper trail of utility bills that threatened to bankrupt a Vermont dairy farmer, all orchestrated by Speaker Mike Johnson using a single, devastating 7-year-old quote. The genesis of this high-stakes confrontation did not begin in a hearing room, but rather during a fateful interview with Politico on February 7, 2019. It was exactly 3 days before Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey were scheduled to formally introduce the Green New Deal resolution on the floor of Congress. At that time, Nancy Pelosi had been wielding the Speaker's gavel for merely 5 weeks, attempting to manage a fractured caucus. The Green New Deal had utterly dominated every progressive policy discussion for the preceding 2 months, capturing the imagination of activists nationwide. Naturally, the burning question every political journalist thrust at the incoming speaker was whether she would put the full, formidable force of her newly reclaimed majority behind this sweeping legislation. Her initial response was a masterclass in political deflection. "It will be one of several, or maybe many suggestions that we receive," she offered smoothly. But then, she dropped a rhetorical hammer. She added a phrase that would relentlessly follow the Green New Deal through 7 years of turbulent political history, attaching itself to the movement like a dark, inescapable second shadow. The Green Dream, or whatever they call it, nobody knows what it is, but they re for it, right? Those dismissive words were not fired across the aisle by a political rival. They were spoken by the most powerful Democrat in the entire country, aimed directly at the most significant progressive climate policy framework introduced in the modern era. The timing was brutally ironic. They were spoken in the exact same month that Bernie Sanders had publicly and passionately endorsed the resolution. Sanders, the fiercely independent senator from Vermont who caucused with the Democrats, had spent 40 years tirelessly arguing that climate change was the absolute existential threat of their generation. He had described the Green New Deal as a critical, non-negotiable step toward a sustainable human future. Sanders was unequivocally for it. Meanwhile, his own party's legislative leader had casually branded it the Green Dream or whatever, openly claiming that nobody knows what it is. The dynamic between the two was extraordinarily complex. Sanders and Pelosi had sat across from each other at the highest Democratic leadership tables for more than 2 decades. They had bled together on the same side of most major legislative battles. In the highly specific and peculiar arena of progressive Democratic politics, they were deeply entrenched allies, yet they harbored fundamentally divergent visions regarding what their decades-long alliance was actually trying to build. On that February afternoon in 2019, the very person who commanded the House during the historic passages of healthcare reform, sweeping financial regulations, and the American Rescue Plan had casually dismissed what Sanders considered the defining moral challenge of their generation. Fast forward 7 years. March 20th, 2026. Speaker of the House Mike Johnson sat at a committee table, staring at a single, immaculate folder. In the top left corner of that folder, he had printed those exact words. Johnson had placed the quote there deliberately, executing a tactic favored by seasoned trial lawyers. You place the most critical, damning document in the exact position where your eyes will encounter it first, because that singular document sets the psychological register for every single argument that follows. Johnson was absolutely going to use Pelosi's words, but not in the way they had been weaponized before. He wasn't using them as a casual dismissal. He was using them to expose a devastating irony. The Green Dream, or whatever, was not a conservative attack line. It was the unfiltered perspective of the person whose political party had entirely controlled the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the White House. They possessed every conceivable institutional tool required to translate the Green New Deal's ambitious framework into binding federal law. Yet, it languished. The phrase perfectly communicated what the political establishment actually thought about the resolution behind closed doors it had been for it, right? Johnson came armed for a fiscal war. He possessed the heritage energy model. He held the highly specific numbers generated from the International Energy Agency's rigorous analysis, detailing the Inflation Reduction Act's actual emissions impact strictly relative to its documented fiscal cost. He had compiled the Green New Deal's staggering estimated cost ranges, wildly fluctuating from $7 trillion to $93 trillion, depending entirely on which analyst ran the math and what baseline assumptions were applied. Furthermore, he had painstakingly catalogued Bernie Sanders' specific, documented public statements defending the resolution across the entire 7-year span since its dramatic introduction. And framing all of this data, sitting quietly in the top left corner, was the green dream, or whatever. Johnson set the folder flat on the polished wood. He waited. The House Budget Committee's special session on federal energy and climate spending, fiscal projections, and localized economic impact had been marked on the congressional calendar for 6 tense weeks. The event had been organized with the specific, highly disciplined, bipartisan procedural care of a committee that fully understood the gravity of the moment. They were inviting a nationally prominent figure, a man wielding a 40-year public record and commanding a passionate, highly organized national following into a confined space. In this room, the specific numerical implications of that towering figure's signature policy positions were going to be dissected. The examination would be executed with the cold, methodical precision that the constitutional responsibility of the federal budget process inherently demands. Bernie Sanders had been formally invited in his capacity as the senior senator from Vermont, widely recognized as the most prominent congressional advocate for both the Green New Deal framework and the massive climate spending provisions embedded within the Inflation Reduction Act. Mike Johnson had been invited in his capacity as Speaker of the House, appearing in the rare role of a special presenter, entirely with the committee chairman's formal consent. The battlefield was Longworth Room 1100. By 9:00 inches the morning, the public gallery had reached maximum capacity. The press section was packed to a suffocating density, the kind of standing room-only crowd that immediately communicates deep historical significance. Overhead, the lights cast a flat, warm, documentary brightness, the specific illumination of a room that has been meticulously organized for the permanent congressional record. The stenographer sat perfectly still at her machine. The broadcast cameras were locked tightly at their designated stations. The ambient air carried that highly specific, electrified quality found only in rooms where the impending proceedings are massively consequential and where the people sitting at the tables have spent their entire professional lives preparing for exactly this type of intellectual combat. Mike Johnson was 54 years old. He had held the gavel as Speaker of the House since the chaotic October of 2023. He was chosen on a historically dysfunctional day when the chamber had entirely failed to find a governing majority for 4 successive nominees, finally settling on Johnson in the specific, highly improbable manner that deep institutional crises so often produce utterly unexpected outcomes. Before navigating the treacherous halls of Congress, he had been a meticulous constitutional lawyer for 20 years. He spent decades arguing complex First Amendment and religious liberty cases before federal courts arenas that strictly required him to state precisely what the written text meant, offering nothing more and nothing less. Born in Shreveport, Louisiana, Johnson was the son of a dedicated firefighter who had been critically burned in the line of duty when Johnson was just 12 years old. He was the first individual in his entire family history to attend college. Throughout his entire congressional career, he had relentlessly hammered home one specific, unwavering argument, presenting it in dozens of different forms. The words etched into foundational documents mean exactly what they say. The individuals charged with implementing those documents are strictly accountable to what the text actually dictates, rather than what their political ideology would prefer it to say. He applied this rigid, uncompromising standard to constitutional law. He applied it to federal budget documents, and today he was applying it to the specific, documented cost projections of progressive energy policy frameworks. Johnson fundamentally believed the rhetorical framing of these climate policies was systematically and dangerously decoupled from their harsh fiscal mathematics. He rested his hands on the folder. He possessed the mathematics. He was entirely ready. Sitting perfectly upright across the room was Bernie Sanders, now 84 years old. He was born on September 8, 1941, deeply rooted in Flatbush, Brooklyn, raised in a working-class Jewish household of Polish immigrant origin. The hardships of his youth were foundational. His father had earned a meager living selling paint, and his mother had tragically passed away when Sanders was merely 18. His academic journey took him from Brooklyn College to the prestigious University of Chicago, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science in 1964. It was there that his ideological fire was truly ignited, participating heavily in historic civil rights demonstrations meticulously organized by the Congress of Racial Equality and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He had personally engaged in sit-ins, fiercely protesting the university's discriminatory housing segregation policies. Following graduation, he relocated to the quiet state of Vermont, working with his hands as a carpenter, exploring narratives as a documentary filmmaker, and finding his voice as a writer. His political ascent was grassroots in its purest form. He was elected mayor of Burlington in 1981 by a microscopic margin of just 10 votes, going on to serve 4 highly impactful terms. He broke into federal politics when elected to the House of Representatives as a fierce independent in 1990, serving as the only independent member of Congress and holding that ground for 16 years. Elevated to the Senate in 2006, he had been re-elected by the people of Vermont 4 consecutive times. At 84, his voice still carried the gravelly boom of a revolutionary. He was still running relentlessly on the exact same platform he had built his mayoral campaign upon in 1981. The American economy is structurally rigged in favor of the ultra-wealthy and massive corporations purposefully designed to crush working people. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that the political system was the only vehicle available to correct this massive societal rigging, but only if enough of the suppressed working class organized themselves to forcefully demand that correction. He had formerly wielded immense power as the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, and currently sat as the ranking member of the Senate Help Committee. When the Green New Deal was introduced in 2019, he didn't just endorse it. He loudly championed it as a bold, necessary, and critically urgent step for humanity. He had personally helped design the intricate climate spending provisions woven into the Inflation Reduction Act. Sanders had been delivering the exact same message he was preparing to deliver in this room for 43 solid years. He had absolutely no expectation or intention of changing his fundamental argument simply because the room happened to be controlled by a Republican majority, or because the man holding the Speaker's gavel was a strict constitutional lawyer hailing from Louisiana. Sanders sat at the witness table, radiating the specific, weathered, utterly genuine composure of a man who has been screaming the exact same truth into the political wind since 1981. He was a man who had empirically found that maintaining unbroken consistency across 43 years, despite an endless parade of critics telling him he was fundamentally wrong, was the singular, undeniable argument that had eventually produced the legislative outcomes he had spent his life trying to manifest. In the second row of the crowded public gallery, occupying the dead center seat, sat a woman named Patricia Lundgren. She was 58 years old, a resilient dairy farmer hailing from Addison County, nestled deeply in the Champlain Valley of Vermont. She was the proud third generation of her family to work the exact same soil that her grandfather had bravely purchased back in 1954. He had moved his entire life from Minnesota to Vermont with one specific, guiding intention: to raise a family in a state that still fiercely protected the kind of traditional agriculture and the tight-knit kind of community relationships that his own generation had been fortunate enough to grow up experiencing. The legacy of the land was written in her blood. Her father had proudly taken over the Farm S operations in 1977, successfully expanding the daily milking herd from 40 cows up to 90. Patricia had formally taken the reins of the operation in 2009, stepping up after her father's health had severely declined. She had poured her sweat into running it for 17 grueling years. Currently, she was single-handedly maintaining a healthy herd of 86 dairy cows, supplementing her incredibly thin margins with a small sideline operation boiling maple syrup. She hustled to sell that syrup locally at the bustling Burlington Farmers Market and innovated by shipping it through a modern subscription model built on a website she had painstakingly coded herself, working late into the quiet evenings, long after the grueling evening milking was finally done. Patricia Lundgren was a person who understood the world through hard data. She possessed the specific, brutally non-theoretical understanding of someone who had been meticulously balancing a working Farm S ledger for 17 years. She knew exactly, down to the decimal, what rising energy costs meant to a rural household that had to simultaneously heat two massive barns, continuously run industrial refrigeration systems, operate heavy-duty electric milking equipment twice a day, and maintain the aging residential structures where 3 of her family members actually lived. The reality on the ground in her state was terrifying. Vermont's electricity rates consistently ranked among the highest in the entire nation. It was a severe economic condition driven by multiple complex causes, a crisis that had been steadily deepening over the exact same period during which Senator Sanders had been loudly advocating for sweeping energy policies. The projected costs of Sanders' policies, when run through the Heritage Energy model and corroborated by several competing independent analyses, included one highly specific, terrifying projection. Household electricity costs were modeled to increase by an agonizing 12 to 14% under the full, mandated implementation of the Green New Deal. She was not an uninformed voter. Patricia had actively attended 3 separate Bernie Sanders town hall meetings in Vermont across the preceding decade. Sitting in those folding chairs, she had listened intently as he passionately described the massive fossil fuel industry as the ultimate opponent of the working people. He called them the existential threat to the survival of the planet and the root source of the crippling economic and environmental injustice that his entire political career had been meticulously organized to combat. Patricia had nodded along, genuinely agreeing with significant portions of what he said, yet remaining highly skeptical of the practical mechanics of other parts. Driven by this deep anxiety for her family's legacy, she had taken action. In March of 2023, and then again in November of 2024, she had sat at her kitchen table and written detailed, earnest letters to Sanders' regional office in Burlington. She asked one highly specific, desperate question. What would the actual modeled financial impact of his proposed sweeping energy transition policies be on Vermont agricultural operations? Operations like hers that absolutely required high-volume electricity usage to survive, and that were already operating on financial margins so razor-thin, the devastating difference between running a viable dairy operation and facing total bank foreclosure was literally measured in mere cents per hundredweight of milk. The response she received from her political hero was deeply crushing. She had received 2 automated, deeply impersonal form letters, Now, she had driven the long miles from rural Addison County directly to Washington, D.C., arriving at the formal invitation of the Budget Committee's majority staff. She sat quietly in the gallery, wearing the exact same rugged Carhartt vest she wore out on the farm, when the brisk Vermont temperature required core insulation, but wasn't quite cold enough to demand a full winter jacket. Resting heavily in her lap was a thick folder containing 17 complete years of her family farm's electricity costs. On top of that stack of bills rested a single, devastating one-page calculation she had done herself at her kitchen table. It showed, with terrifying clarity, exactly what a sudden 12% electricity rate increase would mean to her annual operating budget. The calculation was not complicated calculus. It was basic, brutal subtraction. At precisely 10:00 a.m., Chairman Jody Arrington struck the gavel, bringing the high-stakes session to order, and immediately recognized Senator Sanders for his opening statement. Sanders slowly turned his posture toward the microphone, moving with the specific, unhurried, commanding directness that had become his undeniable signature presence in Senate committee rooms. It was the hardened posture of a man who has organized the exact same ideological argument in 100 different forms for 43 years. He exhibited absolutely no remaining anxiety about the impending debate, because to Sanders, the argument is the argument. It has not changed, it will not change, simply because the underlying scientific and economic evidence has not changed. Chairman Arrington, Speaker Johnson, members of the committee, Sanders began, his voice immediately filling the room. I want to begin by stating what I believe are the most important numbers on the table this morning, because I believe that the numbers presented clearly and honestly make the case for the direction I have been advocating for better than any rhetorical framing can. He leaned closer to the mic. The last decade was the hottest decade in recorded human history. He laid out the terrifying timeline, noting that the International Panel on Climate Change had officially assessed that the critical window for limiting the globe's average temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius is closing rapidly. He cited stark analyses suggesting that catastrophic window may permanently close by the year 2035 if current global emission trajectories are not significantly, aggressively altered. He pivoted to the immediate financial devastation. The staggering cost of climate-related natural disasters in the United States in the year 2023 alone massively exceeded $92 billion in total insured losses, citing data directly from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He juxtaposed that tragedy against corporate greed, pointing out that the global fossil fuel industry had received, in that exact same year, approximately $700 billion in global direct and indirect government subsidies. Pulling the math from the International Monetary Fund, Sanders paused, ensuring the room felt the weight of the math. Let me say that again. $700 billion in global subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in a single year. His tone hardened into righteous anger. That, he argued, is the exact industry that this congressional committee is being asked to heavily protect by intentionally defunding the clean energy transition. He stared down the Republican majority. The question before this committee, he insisted, is not whether the United States can somehow afford to invest in a massive clean energy transition. The question is whether the United States can afford not to. He delivered the line with the flat, genuine, 43-year force of a man who has been making this exact argument since before most of the young staffers in the room were even born. He believes every single syllable of it. That deep ideological belief has not been shaken for a second by the sheer number of times the argument has been cynically challenged, or the grueling number of elections he has run to defend it. Sanders transitioned to the offensive, defending his legislative victories. The Inflation Reduction Act's clean energy provisions, which I helped design and which I am proud to have advocated for, have produced, according to the Department of Energy, more than $300 billion in private investment in clean energy infrastructure, more than 200,000 manufacturing jobs in solar, wind, and battery storage production, and the first sustained decline in United States carbon emissions since the measurement series began. He chopped his hand against the table for emphasis. Those are the actual, tangible outcomes happening right now in the actual economy. Not projections, not models, actual jobs, actual investment, actual emissions reduction. He acknowledged the conservative attacks head-on. The fundamental budget question I want this committee to actively engage with, he noted, is not whether this massive federal investment has been costly. He openly admitted it has been costly. The real budget question, Sanders argued, is whether the upfront cost of the investment is lower or higher than the apocalyptic cost of the alternative. That alternative is the catastrophic cost of unmitigated climate disruption ravaging the American economy over the next 50 years, a nightmare denominated in billions of dollars in flood damage, devastating drought losses, uncontrollable wildfire costs, severe heat-related workforce productivity losses, and the endless, crushing cycle of infrastructure replacement. I believe the investment is cheaper, Sanders declared, his eyes locking on to Johnson. I have the numbers to support that belief. I am ready to defend those numbers. He issued the challenge with the full, highly compressed 43-year force of a man who has been standing on the political front lines, completely ready to defend these exact numbers since the year 1981. Speaker Mike Johnson did not flinch. He adjusted his microphone with the specific, organized, incredibly patient clarity of a seasoned constitutional lawyer, preparing to begin a highly structured presentation in a courtroom where the rigid structure itself is the weaponized argument. Senator Sanders, I want to acknowledge something at the outset of this examination that I think will make the proceeding more honest than it would otherwise be. Johnson began, his voice deceptively calm. He laid down his concessions like stepping stones. I accept that climate change is real. I accept that the economic costs of a warming climate are real. I accept that the Inflation Reduction Act has produced some of the investment outcomes you just described. Then, the lawyer closed the trap. What I am going to examine this morning is the specific, documented fiscal cost of the specific policy framework you have been most closely associated with, and whether the documented projections of that framework as economic impact on the specific working Americans you have spent your entire career claiming to represent are actually consistent with the outcome you say you want to produce for them. Johnson's eyes dropped to the top left corner of his pristine folder. And I am going to begin with a phrase that I believe is the most honest description of the policy framework in question that has been produced in the past 7 years. The room went dead silent. The green dream, or whatever they call it, nobody knows what it is. But they for it, right? Johnson delivered the quote with a flat, patient, evidentiary quiet. He spoke with the cadence of a man who knew the devastating weight was carried entirely in the words themselves, rather than requiring any theatrical delivery. Those are not my words, Johnson clarified, letting the irony bleed into the record. They are the words of Speaker Nancy Pelosi, delivered in February of 2019, when you had just proudly endorsed the Green New Deal, and the Democratic Party's most powerful political figure had casually described it as something nobody knows what it is. Sanders' jaw tightened. The controlled, highly experienced, but nonetheless genuine irritability of a man who has battled in the brutal political arena for over 4 decades flared up. He instantly recognized when an old quote was being cynically deployed purely for theatrical effect. Speaker Johnson, I'm highly familiar with that quote. Sanders fired back. He rapidly dismantled the context, pointing out that Nancy Pelosi had made that flippant statement before the actual resolution was even formally introduced to Congress. She had spoken before she had even read the full legislative text. He forcefully noted that she subsequently went on the record to express her support for the resolution's overarching goals. The quote you are citing does not represent the Democratic Party's considered formal position on the Green New Deal, Sanders stated firmly. It represents a single, off-the-cuff comment made by a political leader who was actively navigating the highly complex internal politics of a deeply divided caucus, that included both progressive and moderate members, and who was being exceptionally careful about exactly how far in front of them she appeared to be. Sanders leaned in, his tone flat, impatient, and carrying the genuine force of someone who has spent his entire life fighting for ideas and refuses to be distracted by the petty political sociology of Pelosi's media comment management. The substantive merits of the Green New Deal's framework are not magically determined by whether one political figure was dismissive of it during a Politico interview in February 2019, he argued. They are determined entirely by the hard evidence for the policies the framework actually proposes. Johnson nodded slowly, completely unbothered by the senator's irritation. I accept that the quote was an off-the-cuff comment, and that it does not represent a settled policy position, Johnson conceded smoothly. I am using it for a highly specific and very different purpose than you may expect. He tapped the folder. I am using it because I believe it is the most honest, single-sentence description currently available of the massive, glaring gap between the Green New Deal's soaring rhetorical power and its absolute lack of policy specificity. Nobody knows what it is, but they re for it, Johnson repeated quietly. The speaker systematically laid out the timeline of failure. Senator Sanders, you endorsed the Green New Deal in 2019. You have repeatedly described it to the American people as bold and necessary. You have utilized it as the primary rhetorical frame for the massive climate spending provisions you recently championed in the Inflation Reduction Act. Johnson's voice sharpened. And yet, in 7 long years, from February 2019 to this morning in March 2026, the Green New Deal has not been enacted. It has not been marked up in committee, nor has it even been brought to a simple floor vote. What has been enacted is merely portions of its conceptual framework, quietly embedded in much larger legislative vehicles like the IRA. I want to examine those enacted portions today, with the specific, ruthless fiscal precision that this committee's constitutional responsibility absolutely requires. Johnson unleashed the mathematics. He cited the conservative heritage energy model, which purposefully utilizes the government's own Energy Information Administration modeling tool, noting its terrifying projection that the Green New Deal's full, mandated implementation would violently produce a massive shortfall of 1.4 million American jobs by the year 2040, measured relative to a standard baseline scenario. It projected a catastrophic reduction in the national GDP of $3.9 trillion and a crippling increase in annual family income loss exceeding $40,000 per household. Anticipating the immediate pushback, Johnson held up a hand. I want to openly note that those severe projections are hotly contested by other competing models. But I also want to firmly note what all the models, including the highly optimistic models that project net economic benefits, universally agree on. They agree that there is a painful transition period during which the massive costs of moving away from our existing, cheap energy sources arrive long before the full economic benefits of the new, green energy sources are ever realized. Johnson locked his gaze on the senator. The defining question of this hearing is who exactly pays during that transition period and whether the working people being forced to pay can actually afford to pay. Slowly, deliberately, Johnson turned his body toward the public gallery. Patricia Lundgren is sitting in the second row of this gallery. He pronounced her name with the specific, highly deliberate, hushed quiet of a constitutional lawyer making the most vital human connection of his entire opening argument. Patricia farms 86 dairy cows in Addison County, Vermont, Johnson stated. Vermont is your state, Senator. Patricia is your constituent, and Vermont currently suffers from some of the highest electricity rates in the entire nation. Dairy farming is an incredibly energy-intensive operation, Johnson continued, turning the knife of reality. In March of 2023, and again in November of 2024, Patricia sat down and wrote to your Burlington office, desperately asking what the modeled financial impact of your proposed energy policies would actually be on vulnerable Vermont agricultural operations. Johnson gestured toward the gallery. She received 2 automated form letters. She brought a folder with her today. That folder contains 17 years of her family farm's electricity costs and a simple 1-page calculation showing exactly what a 12% electricity increase would mean to her annual operating budget. Johnson placed his hands flat on the folder. His tone was ice cold. The math is not complicated. It is subtraction. In the second row, the cameras pivoted slightly to capture Patricia Lundgren. She sat perfectly still in her worn Carhartt vest, her hands resting firmly on the thick folder containing the 17 years of crippling electricity costs and her solitary, terrifying, 1-page calculation. She wasn't a political operative. She had personally driven to 3 Bernie Sanders town halls over the years. Sitting in the audience, she had watched her senator deliver his famous, roaring speech about relentlessly fighting for the working people and protecting the small farmers in rural communities that had been ruthlessly left behind by the greedy billionaire class and the corrupt fossil fuel industry. She had deeply felt the soaring passion in his speech, and she recognized in her bones that his anger was entirely genuine. She completely agreed with the core of what that passion was organized around, even as her practical mind remained highly skeptical of the mechanical details. She fundamentally agreed that the absentee billionaires were getting far too much of the pie. But she was deeply skeptical that the practical solution to the billionaire problem was a sweeping federal policy whose projected, massive energy cost increase would violently arrive on her monthly electricity bill years before the loudly promised green jobs ever miraculously arrived in Vermont's struggling dairy economy. Patricia had not driven to those town halls to pick a fight or argue with him. She had gone because he was her elected senator, and she firmly believed in the civic duty of showing up. She had even bravely raised her hand twice at the second town hall back in 2019, asking him highly specific, grounded questions about the terrifying agricultural energy cost projections under the mandated clean energy transition. Sanders had offered her a thoughtful but frustratingly general answer about the overarching importance of heavily protecting agricultural communities during the difficult transition. Unsatisfied but resolute, she had gone home, sat at her table, and written the detailed letter in March of 2023. She received a hollow form letter. She tried again, writing a second desperate plea in November of 2024. She received another hollow form letter. She was 58 years old. She had been physically working the exact same plot of land for 17 years. Continuing a proud legacy her family had been farming for 70 years. She had not driven to Washington, D.C. today because she was somehow against saving the planet. She was sitting in this intimidating room because the critical protection of the planet and the brutal reality of her farm's electricity bill were both entirely real things. Both of those massive, undeniable realities needed to somehow fit into the exact same mathematical calculation in order for her family to survive. The political form letters she received had utterly failed to engage with that terrifying calculation. So, she had driven from Addison County to the capital of the United States. She was sitting quietly in the second row, her name echoing through the chamber, the folder resting heavy in her lap, and she waited in the silence, hoping the senator who had spent his entire life fiercely fighting for working people since before she was even born, would finally look her in the eye and tell her what he should have told her in that form letter, if the form letter had actually been a human. Direct response. Bernie Sanders turned his body away from the speaker. He looked directly up into the gallery, his eyes locking onto the Vermont dairy farmer. Patricia, I want to speak to you directly, because I believe that is what this committee and what this hearing truly deserve. His voice carried the genuine, unhurried, heavy biographical force of a man who was literally born in a struggling, working-class Brooklyn family. A man who had been out in the streets fighting for the working class since before Patricia Lundgren took her first breath. He meant every word he said. Even the harshest conservative critics, who vehemently disagreed with his radical methods, often quietly acknowledged that Bernie Sanders absolutely means what he says. The energy transition is going to have costs, Sanders admitted, his voice echoing in the still room. I have never said it would not. The fundamental question is not whether there are going to be costs. The question is who bears them, and how large they are, and whether the federal policy is designed specifically enough to actively protect the working people who are least able to absorb them. He leaned forward, his hands clasped. What I have fought for consistently, and in literally every single budget and appropriations fight I have ever engaged in, is to ensure that the massive costs of this transition fall squarely on the fossil fuel industry and on the wealthiest corporations and individuals in this country, and absolutely not on dairy farmers struggling in Addison County. He pointed to the legislation, noting that the specific tax credits woven into the Inflation Reduction Act, the targeted agricultural energy efficiency provisions, and the massive rural electrification modernization funding were explicitly and purposefully designed to reduce the crushing energy cost burden on agricultural operations exactly like hers. But then, the 84-year-old warrior did something incredibly rare in modern congressional hearings. He stripped away the political armor. I would not claim that we have done enough on that front, Sanders conceded heavily. I would not claim that Vermont dairy farmers are completely protected from the brutal costs of this transition. He quickly pivoted back to the apocalyptic alternative. What I would claim, however, is that the alternative, which is the unimaginable cost of a rapidly heating planet over the next 50 years, is a cost that will inevitably fall on the most economically vulnerable people first. It will fall on the farmers who will completely lose their crops to historic drought. It will fall on the coastal communities that will lose their generational land to sea level rise. It will fall on the working families who will be forced to pay drastically more for basic food as global agricultural disruption massively increases. Sanders paused. The room held its breath. He looked back at Patricia. Patricia, the form letters were not what you deserved. He delivered the admission with the flat, specific, unapologetic biographical directness of a man who is actively choosing to say a very hard, very true thing under the bright lights of a congressional hearing room. The detailed letters you took the time to write deserved a highly specific response about the agricultural provisions embedded in the legislation and their precise, projected impact on your Vermont operations. The form letters my office sent did not provide that. That is a fundamental failure of my office's constituent engagement, and I am not going to sit here and defend it. It was a staggering moment of pure, political honesty delivered with the genuine, weathered 43-year-old force of someone saying something deeply true that actually costs him something politically. Speaker Johnson did not offer sympathy. He offered the ledger. Senator Sanders, I accept the argument you are making regarding the intended distribution of the transition's costs, but I want the record to note exactly what your admission implies, Johnson stated cleanly. You have openly acknowledged on the record that the costs are very real, and that vital agricultural operations exactly like Patricia Lundgren's are absolutely not fully protected from them. I want to add one specific, highly documented fact to that incredible acknowledgement. Johnson referenced the data in his folder. The conservative heritage model chillingly projects that the Green New Deal's full, unmitigated implementation would violently produce a $40,000 annual income loss for the average American family by the year 2040. The current median household income in the state of Vermont is approximately $63,000 per year, Johnson noted, his eyes locking onto Sanders. Senator, a $40,000 loss on a $63,000 working-class household income is not a transition cost. It is a total economic collapse. Johnson moved for the political kill shot, bringing the ghost of Nancy Pelosi back into the room. I also want to note something highly specific about exactly who has been for the Green Dream or whatever for the past 7 years. You have been for it. The Progressive Congressional Caucus has been for it. The elite academic institutions that theoretically modeled it have been for it. The passionate activists who organized in the streets around it have been for it. And yet, Johnson's voice hardened. The very speaker who dismissively called it the Green Dream, or whatever the woman who entirely controlled the legislative machinery that could have actually translated it from a mere resolution into binding federal law, whose party held both chambers of Congress and the White House for 2 full years, did not even put it on the floor calendar for a vote. Nobody knows what it is, but they for it, is the Democratic Speaker's own brutal description of your signature policy framework. I am not quoting it to be dismissive today, Johnson clarified. I am quoting it to permanently note that the massive, glaring gap between simply being for the Green Dream, or whatever, and actually being able to precisely describe its specific, devastating costs for Patricia Lundgren's monthly electricity bill is the exact gap that this budget committee is constitutionally required to examine. Johnson set both his hands firmly flat on the folder. The math is not complicated, he repeated quietly into the microphone. It is subtraction. The cavernous hearing room completely absorbed this final, devastating summation. It possessed the specific, highly charged quality of a room that has been steadily building towards a massive collision for an hour, and has just watched it violently arrive in the most precise, unassailable form possible. The dense press section was entirely, uncomfortably still. In the second row, Patricia Lundgren remained seated with the heavy folder resting in her lap, her calloused hands pressed flat against the rough fabric of her Carhartt vest. She exhibited the specific, nonpartisan, highly professional attention of a working dairy farmer who has meticulously run these exact same terrifying numbers for 17 years. She had driven the long highway from Addison County to the Capitol because the abstract numbers that are casually debated by men in suits in budget committees are the exact, literal numbers that determine whether her family farm lives or dies. She had desperately wanted to be physically present in the room where her livelihood was discussed, demanding the absolute precision her farm requires to survive. Sanders sat perfectly still. He radiated the specific, genuine, hard, weathered stillness of an 84-year-old man who has been fiercely fighting for the exact same moral principles since 1981. He had just absorbed a devastating, perfectly executed question that accurately exposed the massive, incredibly painful gap between his soaring ideological principles and the brutal, compromised outcome of the political process he has been engaged in for 43 years. Faced with the trap, the old revolutionary actively decided to give the painful, honest answer, rather than retreating into a defensive political spin. Speaker Johnson, the Green Dream, or whatever, is an utterly embarrassing, cynical description of the most important climate policy framework ever introduced in modern American history. Sanders fired back, his voice thick with disgust. I agreed with Nancy Pelosi on many critical things across many years. I did not agree with how she cynically treated that framework or the passionate young people who built it. He refused to yield the moral high ground. What I can tell you today is that the framework was incredibly real, even when the institutional democratic response to it was utterly dismissive. The terrifying emissions data was real. The catastrophic economic projections for unmitigated climate disruption were real. He attacked Johnson's math. The $40,000 income loss that your conservative heritage model projects is fiercely contested by at least 5 independent, peer-reviewed analyses that project massive net economic gains under a managed clean energy transition. I am absolutely not going to sit here and concede that highly flawed heritage model as the definitive, unassailable arithmetic of the transition. But Sanders knew he couldn't dodge the human element sitting in the second row. What I will completely concede, Sanders stated heavily, is that Patricia Lundgren's desperate calculation in that folder is absolutely real, and it is entirely uncontested. Her crippling electricity costs are what they are. The hollow form letters my office sent were absolutely not what she deserved. The federal transition support funding that should have been far more specifically directed to aggressively protect agricultural operations exactly like hers was simply not specific enough. Sanders delivered his final plea with the specific, highly compressed, totally genuine honesty of a man, openly acknowledging the painful, glaring gap between a noble ambition and its flawed execution, absolutely, without conceding the ultimate necessity of the ambition itself. Both of those things are undeniably true, he concluded, and both of those truths require us to instantly build better, more precise policy. Not the cowardly abandonment of the entire framework. The heavy wooden gavel fell, echoing sharply through the chamber. The sprawling Longworth room was instantly consumed by a heavy, incredibly complicated silence. The specific silence of a congressional proceeding that has surprisingly arrived at a mutual, unvarnished acknowledgement of two massive, undeniable truths that completely fail to resolve each other. The existential climate framework Sanders had championed for decades was absolutely real. The crushing, immediate costs of the transition on the working class were absolutely real, and caught directly in the unforgiving crossfire between those two massive realities was Patricia Lundgren's physical electricity bill, waiting in perpetual political limbo for a federal policy to become precise enough to actually address it. In the second row of the public gallery, Patricia Lundgren slowly stood from her seat. She adjusted her Carhartt vest, firmly gripping the heavy folder containing 17 grueling years of skyrocketing electricity costs, her solitary one-page mathematical calculation, and the two hollow form letters from her political hero. She possessed the specific, deeply practical understanding that this historic, televised hearing had ultimately produced a moment of stunning political acknowledgement, but absolutely no tangible policy change. The admission was certainly more dignity than the automated form letters had ever provided, yet it remained vastly less than what her failing family farm required to survive the coming winter. She didn't linger to shake hands with staffers. She didn't wait in the corridor to offer a soundbite for the hungry press corps gathered outside the double doors, carrying the naked truth that Washington's grand policies still hadn't caught up to her brutal reality. She simply turned and walked toward the gallery exit. The hearing adjourned, the politicians returned to their offices, and Patricia began the long drive back to Addison because no matter the policy, the cows still need to be milked.